So it's great being here. I'm supposed to speak about how to win a Nobel Prize. Sure. Well, it's very difficult to give general rules on winning a Nobel Prize, and I think even the Nobel Committee would have difficulties doing so. But I can tell you what I did to win a Nobel Prize. And so, in a way, I'm going to tell you a bit about my story. So, about my idea, of course, and how I managed to make my ideas come true. And of course, I will give you some idea of what can be done with this idea and why it is useful. Now, you certainly know that visual perception is, of course, extremely important to humans, and therefore it's probably not a coincidence that many important discoveries in the natural science are due to the fact that scientists were able to see something. If you want to see things at very small scales, of course, we have to rely on microscopy. And therefore, I think it's not a coincidence that at the beginning of biology, modern biology, of course, very much coincides with the invention of the light microscope, because with the light microscope, scientists were able to see for the first time that every living being consists of cells as basic units of structure and function. And as you know, bacteria were discovered with a light microscope. But I'm sure you will remember your school days when you learned that the resolution of a light microscope is limited. And if you want to get a higher spatial resolution, you have to resort to electron microscopy. Now, there's no doubt about the fact that electron microscopy attained a much higher spatial resolution, down to the atomic level or even subatomic level nowadays. And so I'm going to talk about improving the resolution of a light microscope, because that was the idea that I got the Nobel Prize for. And if you're a physicist, of course, you ask, okay, why would you do that now that we have the electron microscope? Now, the answer is very simple. With electron microscopy, you can only look into that material, with very few exceptions. And well, we know already there is the nucleus in a cell, there is the Golgi apparatus, and so on. We've seen that. We want to know what molecules do. How does the Golgi apparatus work? And in that case, it has to be functional. So it has to work in a living cell. And light microscopy is the only way by which you can look into the interior of a living cell in 3D with minimal harm. And that's the reason why it was important to think about whether it's possible to break the resolution barrier of the light microscope and come up with a sort of microscopy that has a much higher spatial resolution, but allows you to see things in living cells. And not only that, see distributions of proteins, for example, especially, say, in fluorescence microscopy, because fluorescence is a very, very sensitive and very, very effective way of labeling. Now, this barrier that you've seen, that wall, was there for quite some time. It was discovered at the end of the 19th century by this man, Ernst Abbe, in Jena. And he formulated this equation, which was written here on a memorial, which was erected in his honor. And you see now this equation being written in stone, if you like. And this is what scientists believed throughout the 20th century, that if you want to discern two features of the same kind, they have to be away, at least by a distance d, given by the wavelengths divided by this number, which is the numerical aperture of the objective lens. And not only it was believed that this is the end, it also was a fact. When I was a student in the 80s in physics in Heidelberg, this was the best resolution that you could get, for example, from a cell. So this is a part of cytoskeleton in a cell. As a matter of fact, confocal microscopy turned out to be the best at that time, and this is a confocal image. And so people thought that's the end of it. Now, the method that or the idea I got the Nobel Prize for is this one. And if the light was a bit dimmer, then you could see the details much better. But I think you will get a notion anyway. Here, the resolution is much better. You see these filaments much clearer than what is possible with a technique that was considered to be the end of the story. Now, this major change in resolution, of course, has had a number of consequences. And the consequences it had for me in 2014 was that I all of a sudden got the privilege of meeting Scandinavian kings. And the first king I happened to pleasure to meet was King Harald V of Norway. I shared a so-called Kavli Prize with two colleagues. This Kavli Prize is about the same, is patterned according to the Nobel Prize, and it has similar standards. It's a more recent prize, but I was very happy, and I said, okay, that's the end of the accolades that I will ever get. And so I was surprised that I got a phone call just 4 weeks later saying, oh, you will have the pleasure of meeting his cousin. So King Gustav of Sweden, and they also give a medal, of course, and this is followed by a nice banquet with very good food, I must say, and with very nice company. And actually, I don't know how the yellow press in Germany called me up next morning, because everything is broadcasted on TV, saying, "Oh, what did you discuss with her? You discuss all the time. What did you?" Of course, I didn't tell them, and I'm sure you're not interested in the gossip, so you want to know about about my story. Although there is gossip, I should say. But anyway, I'm going to tell you that was not clear from the beginning that it would end up like this. Now, as some of you may know or not know, I was born actually in this town in what is now western part of Romania, and in 1962, communist Romania, of course. Well, at the age of 13, I realized that communist country, there is not much hope for a future, and this economic system, this political system, is not going to be a winner. And I should say that my family was of German background, because my ancestors had moved from southwestern Germany to that area in the 18th century, late 18th century. And so we took advantage of our German background and managed to get out of the country. Many problems. And we settled here in Ludwigshafen, which is, here. If you ask me why Ludwigshafen and not something else, we didn't have any relations there. It's simple, because here is the River Rhine, as you may know. And my mother was scared of a clash between East and West, and she said, we have to be west of the Rhine, because otherwise you never know. And the British and the Americans would not allow the Russians to cross the Rhine. So this was the belief. And I liked it because it was close to Heidelberg, and I knew, of course, this is a very interesting place because it has the oldest university on German soil, and it's also a good one. And so after getting my high school leaving certificate, I enrolled here and studied physics in 1981. And at a time, I also did my PhD there because it's a nice town, I wanted to stay there. And at a time, I did my PhD. I had to choose, of course, to sign up with somebody. I had, of course, to decide what to do. And most physics students, and though I was no exception, were attracted at that time to doing fundamental physics, of course. So some special, quantum field theory, grand unification. Of course, I was ambitious. I want to do something that is really interesting, and that's why I studied physics and not engineering. But when I had to make this decision, the other students told me you shouldn't do that, because if you become a theoretical physicist, you end up as a taxi driver because there are no jobs, and this is a big problem, and this is a high economic risk. And now, with my background from coming from the East, and my parents still had to struggle in the West. Actually, my mother got very sick, and I'm an only child. I said, okay, well, in the end, I won't be able to do that. I should not do that because I may have to support my parents. And I have to sign up with somebody who does something applied, so can I get a job with a company? And so I signed up with a professor who had a startup company in Heidelberg, at that time called Heidelberg Instruments, in the Heidelberg Technology Park, which is still in existence. And that company specialized in developing light microscopes, to be precise, confocal microscopes for all kinds of purposes, biological inspection, biological imaging, but not only that, computer chip inspection in the first place, writing of structures, ophthalmology, and so on. And so I was asked to check out computer chips made by Siemens and IBM. And I should find out whether the measurement procedure by this confocal microscopy methodology is precise enough or so. And now you can imagine, now if you initially want to do something fundamental, then you end up with inspecting or screening computer chips for Siemens or IBM. Of course, with the motivation, and you may get a job with them, then you have a problem. And so I was, at the end, after 1 year or so, I almost became miserable, simply because I hated this job. It was so boring, there was no science in it, and microscopy, come on, this is the science of the 19th century. There was nothing interesting. I mean, no interesting physics, boring physics, as a matter of fact. And so I had the choice of either becoming miserable, or I said, okay, maybe there's still an interesting problem left with this boring type of physics, which is, well, breaking the diffraction barrier, because this is something that everyone believes wouldn't work, and this is still an interesting physics problem that is left. And if I manage to do that, that would be cool. So that would be something cool. And then at some point, I thought about it, and of course, no, I didn't tell anyone, because people would say totally nuts. And but when I went home in the evening, after doing these silly measurements, I thought about how to break the diffraction barrier, and that kept me going, actually. So I decided, okay, I will look into this. And at some point, I became convinced that it would work. Why? My reasoning was very simple. The diffraction barrier was found in the end of the 19th century, but this was in 1989 or so. And I knew, since then, so much physics has been invented, so much has been done. There must be at least one physical phenomenon that gets me beyond that barrier. People didn't just look at it because everyone thought this is the end of it, and then we do something else. As I said, particle physics, quantum field theory, and the rest of it, but no one looks at this problem anymore. And so I decided to do it. I wanted to stay there, and I had some, well, I went to EMBL, but I didn't believe in it. And then I was lucky that I happened to meet somebody, a Finnish person, who said, okay, you can come to my place. He also came from a startup company. At that time, it was called EG&G Valak. Then now it's PerkinElmer Life Sciences. And that person was the R&D development head of that time, became very successful because he developed immunoassay screening that was commercially very, very successful. And then he got some money from them, and so say, okay, you do your crazy idea with your resolution improvement, and you give me your know-how that you know about microscopy to do my business. And so it was a good deal. It was not philanthropy or so. So it was a good deal. And so, and very capable people, I must say. And so I was very lucky. I got there, and so I could think about my resolution idea, and eventually I got the idea. 8 weeks after I got there, in this interesting place here with very dark winters, and I'm telling you now what the idea was. Now, what is the resolution problem? The microscope basically has a lens. That's the most important element, and this is the sample. And what you do, usually you shine light, say in a modern microscope, it's a laser that is focused into a fluorescent spot, and then what happens actually is that because of diffraction, because of the wave nature of light, you get this spot size that is minimal. You can't make it smaller. And then what happens, this is light for exciting fluorophores. The molecules are turned on, so they absorb light and then get into the high state, and then they emit fluorescence. So what happens, these molecules start to glow. And the problem is, and this really is the problem in a nutshell, all of them emit light, and then, you know, because all of them emit light here, their signal will be confused by the detector. So each of these molecules produces also a blob of diffracted light, and then no detector can tell it apart. Be the eye or anything, no problem. No way of telling it apart. And this is why you cannot separate features that are smaller, less apart than what the size of the spot is, because the signal of all these molecules will be added up in here. And so what was the idea? Well, I realized, and you have to be a physicist for that, not only you can turn molecules on by exciting to make them glow, but you can also turn them off. If you use a wavelength that is redshifted, you can just turn them off, just as you can turn them on. So this is a basic phenomenon that is used, was actually done here in Göttingen to the extreme in the 70s. So I used a beam of light that turns molecules off, and now guess what I did? I modified this beam of light so that those here are turned off and only that one in the center is kept on. And then I see only that one, and now I can tell that one apart from the rest. Simple idea. Just not only turn them on, also turn them off. And then, of course, if you move the beam, you see those molecules sequentially, you see? You can move the beam here, and then you can separate them. That's simple. It's called STAT. Why? Because this off-turning is called stimulated emission. That's a physical term. I published this idea in '94 as a theoretical paper, because the lab in Finland, I mean, since it was supported just by a small company or mid-sized company, there was not so much money. And of course, my boss was also interested in some other things. It was not so easy to realize. And so I went around in many places in the US, and I paid actually I went to conference, I paid a conference fee out of my pocket and my travel to some extent, and advertised this idea, but nobody believed it, believe it or not. Say, oh no, I mean, the diffraction barrier was there for 100 years. Why should this guy from this place no one has heard of, and all of a sudden make a difference? So it was very difficult to survive. And at some point, what I did, I licensed patents that I made on my own, because I was an only person, so to speak, freelance person. And the company, EG&G Wallach, then gave me money in return to develop my idea. And this is how I survived. And that gave me some lead time to meet people. But I must say, despite the hardship, I was much more happy than during my PhD thesis, because I worked on a problem that really interested me. So I worked on a fascinating problem. So although it was really tough, sorting out the science and the survival, I was happy because I worked on a fascinating problem. The message here is you should do the things that you really want to do. And I wanted to break the barrier and wanted to do that because I was convinced at some point that it would work and would be exciting. But in the end, you have to find somebody that supports you, because, I mean, you cannot live out of the box and with this handout money. And so I was lucky that the then managing director of the institute, where I'm now, Tom Jovin by name, he heard me giving a talk and invited me to come here. And after some discussions, the directors here decided to give me a 5-year probation time, so to speak, to prove that I was right or wrong. And although there was some skepticism, not all believed in it, they said, okay, this is the only guy thinking about this problem. If you don't give him a chance of doing it, we will never know if it works or not. So let's give him a chance. And then it worked. This was standard, and this is then what came out. And so it was clear that the idea was right, and we can overcome the diffraction barrier. And of course, you see how the difference. Now getting a factor of 10 of resolution improvement is the standard. And so these are protein complexes, nuclear pores, that are clearly seen here, the 8-fold symmetry. And if you take the normal high-end confocal, there's almost nothing that you can see. I still like making this comparison, I must say, although this is textbook knowledge. But it's very obvious. And of course, you can do many things with it. You can see details that you couldn't see before. Now, and it's going to change cell biology, there's no doubt about it, and to some extent also analytics, because you have an access, and not only that. Initially, of course, when we looked into whether it would be workable, this was very complicated. Now, it's a box. I literally mean it. So I made a startup company, sorry about making this advertisement here in Göttingen and also in Heidelberg, and they provide now these boxes, and you can put on any light microscope, any brand, just a standard light, not confocal, any standard, and it instantly gives you super resolution at a push button. So it has become very robust and an affordable price. And these commercial systems here in Göttingen, they made this picture, which made it actually on the official poster of the 2014 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, where they explained this method of STAT microscopy, which was the first to overcome the diffraction barrier. 6 years later, an American group led by this gentleman published a related method, which has the name Palm or Storm. It has similar principles as this one, so off-turning and on-turning, but works on the single molecule basis, and this is why the committee thought, okay, one should give credit to both. And so this is why I had the honor of sharing the prize with these two gentlemen. And this is the point I'm making here, this is not the end of the story. So this was the time I got the prize, but since then, of course, I've been active, and my group has been active, so it's not that you get a prize, and then if you're really interested in the problem, the prize doesn't matter. Because I wanted to, in the end, get a spatial resolution that is the best possible, and these two methods that got the prize managed to get tenfold higher resolution, which is, of course, a lot, given that everyone thought it would not possible, but did not get to the ultimate limit, which was 1 molecule size resolution. But after the prize, I decided to look into this problem, and I decided early, but we succeeded more recently, to be able to resolve molecules at molecular distance. So these methods couldn't resolve this type of arrangements. So these are molecules that are molecular distance. You see, this method fails. And then what we did is we combined the strengths of both without going into detail. Single molecule capability plus using a donut. And now, this is more recent work published 2017 in Science. You see, we are really down to the molecular scale. I mean, we can really separate fluorescent molecules at molecular distances, the ultimate limit. There won't be any better resolution. And so this shows that this journey, starting out from idea, has now really come to the end. So, and this will also become commercially available. It will change a lot. Like, believe me, if you can go to the synapse, label molecules, and see everything at molecular resolution, plus the option of seeing dynamics, this is going to change a lot. And so we work very hard to disseminate this as well, and this will happen in the coming 5 to 10 years. This will make a major change. Not only that, you can see this is a live E. coli. This is a lousy transmission image, but here molecules are tracked with nanometer precision here, so 40 nanometer precision with a very high speed. So below a millisecond, and this is actually a subunit of a ribosome that is being tracked. No way to do that with a camera. It doesn't work. And so there's a lot of things to do. Molecular dynamics, I could talk about that. But this is an inspirational talk, not a science talk in the first place. The only thing that I would like to mention in here is that this equation, of course, means that it's no longer limited. The d distance really can go down to the molecular scale. And so this is now a total change, and we can really image with molecular scale resolution. And so that's almost the end. But I would like to give you a few messages, maybe which is good for discussion, and then I'm done. Consensus does not always equate reality. This is something that one should be aware of. Consensus sometimes is based on social interactions and so on. Challenging consensus not always greeted. You find a hard time challenging consensus because consensus is often equated with reality. Ideas that bring a huge advancement for mankind can be delayed but not stopped. This is you may like that or not. I'm not saying this is great. I'm just saying it is like that. It can be delayed but not stopped. And the end, fundamental discoveries are usually simple, not complicated. You see, the idea was simple. Turn it off. If it's giving you a mess, just turn it off. So that's it. And finally, if you know that you're right, don't give up. Thank you very much.
Do you think that the light method will ever get as good as, say, X-ray crystallography when you go down into the angstrom? Because the crystallizer protein takes a lot of effort, whereas if you can do it by light fluorescence, it'll be a much quicker method. Is there a physical limit to that, the light fluorescence?
That's a very good question. Yes, the physical limit is the size of the fluorescent molecule. So what the fluorescent microscope sees is actually the fluorescent molecule, not the protein itself. or the labeled molecule. And once the fluorescent microscope identifies every fluorescent molecule in each correct location, it has done its job. So in fluorescent microscopy, it's very important that the label really represents what you want to see. And for that fundamental reason, the resolution limit will always be the size of the fluorescent molecule, or the distance between the fluorescent molecule and a protein, or so that you look at, because there will be a linker or some sort of a bond that will link that label. Having said that, it means that seeing structure per se, or so, like crystallography, would not work. It wouldn't make any sense, because there is crystallography, there is electron microscopy, and they do a great job at that. But what they cannot do is see things in action at a scale, say from 1 2 nanometers up to 100 nanometers, in perhaps even in a living cell, and perhaps even at some point even in a living behaving animal, as far as light can go. And so this is not, it would be silly for us to try to rival the electron microscope or X-ray crystallography and seeing structure, because they work. But what we can do is we can see dynamics. So you have a protein complex, okay, that is 10 nanometer in size or 5 nanometer in size, and you don't know what does it do. Of course, it moves mechanically, because this is what proteins do to interact with. So we can see that, which crystallography cannot see, because it crams all the molecules in a big crystal. Or electron cannot see, because if you put it in, I don't know what, in vacuum and bombard it with electrons, and then you don't see single particle behavior. You average over many data just to get an average. But here you see individual molecule, just that molecule in action. So it opens up a new range of application studies that people didn't think of. Of course, you can imagine adding a drug or so and then see how the protein dynamics changes. It's very obvious.
Thank you.
My question is not a scientific one. It's about the inspiration. What makes you non-stop? If your answer is that because you know that you are right, then how you are confident that you are right?
It's a very, very good question. Yeah, how can you be confident you're right? I think you have to have a good sense for reality, meaning that you have to be self-critical. And this can be, if you're trained as a natural scientist, you know that you have to be self-critical and critical, because nature is going to bog you down. That's very clear. Nature has its rules, and in the end, well, ideology doesn't work. So nature is what nature is. And so, so in other words, what I did, and that is the decisive point, I looked into the problem, and people said it's not going to work because. Then I asked myself, why are they saying this? Is it because there's a real reason? Sometimes the reason was correct. Or do they say this because they're envious? They don't want it to work because they had a competing technology, or that they wanted that somebody makes a difference. And so I was trying to figure out what is there a substance? Is there a truth behind this criticism, or is it not? And then I could distill down the facts, and I realized, no, this is going to work because the facts are like this, like this, like this, like this. And in the end, no matter what they are going to say, the facts are like this. And so, but I had to be self-critical all the time, because I said, this won't work because you cannot turn off the molecules, they come not back again, they will bleach down. Yeah, it was a valid argument, but I looked into this and I found, no, there will be molecules that can be turned on again. I have to just find out how this works, and so on. So you have to really look into the details and boil things down to fact. And there is another thing, which is, I think, very important. There are two types of problems, which one has to distinguish. One is conceptual problems, and one is technical problems. Conceptual problems are of if you have a completely wrong thought and the wrong conclusion because you have the wrong calculation, whatever. Conceptual problem. This and then then it's not going to work because nature in the end doesn't allow you to do it because it's a fundamental conceptual problem. There's no way around it. But then technical problems are problems that will be overcome with time. For example, what is a technical problem? Computers are too slow. Or you need a laser, lasers are too expensive, forget it. Or lasers are not bright enough. So this was all said in the 90s. Oh, this is not going to work, you need a dye laser, big dye laser, and so on. These problems will be sorted out over time. And so what I knew is, even if I have difficulties, and I will have a big apparatus, complex, and so in order to prove that I'm right, if the concept is valid, turn off and on, that's the concept. And this is a viable concept. Then it's going to come. Because there will be technological development around me that will help me sorting out the technical problems. So I didn't do anything for making computers faster, but they came faster. I didn't do anything for making lasers cheaper or more versatile in all the wavelengths, but they are now of this size. Now you see it in that box, in that shoebox. And so these technical problems, they are solved by other people around you. And as long as you have a fundamental concept that is valid, you will win. But it will take some time. It took me, of course, 20 years.
Thank you. Fernanda?
Hi, thank you. Were you ever afraid of talking about your concept idea to someone who would say, hey, that's not going to work, and they would just go off and try and do it without you?
Yeah, good point. So first I patented it, and then I published it. And at that time, when I was in Finland, I thought I probably will never have the chance of doing it because I was in a sort of poor lab, and there was also different interests in the lab for good reasons. And I thought, okay, at least I will get the credit for the idea. And so I published it in writing. And of course, I went to conferences and proposed it as an idea all the time. And hoping that at least I would get the credit for the idea, maybe somebody else would do it. Now, the interesting thing is, I didn't have the means of doing it really. The others, there are many big labs, famous labs in the US with all the lasers. They could have done it. They didn't do it. It's very interesting. They did their own spectroscopy or whatever they always did. In the end, relatively boring stuff. I can say that now very openly. They could have done, they didn't do it. And it's an interesting issue and psychology. After you've done it, of course, once you've done everything works out, then people come up, but I said something there, and I made a remark in that, and there I had a hidden remark in that hidden patent somewhere. That happens when you win the Nobel Prize. And so, so such things always come up. But I think this is why I think the real discoverer is the guy that realizes the importance, not only makes a remark or so, I can make many remarks here, but realizes him and then makes his choice. So this is why, if you're interested in that, I gave the banquet speech at the Nobel banquet in 2014 for the chemists. And I said, you get up every morning, and then you have many choices what to do or what not to do. And if you are convinced that this is important, say for mankind, you get up and do just that and not something else. And I think this is the real discoverer who realizes this is important and gets it done and shows it and say, here it is. Yeah.
I just have a quick question. It's more basic than that. It's more about funding. And I guess in your current role, you may be more familiar with how science funding is. Do you think the way, I guess, the different funding streams affects, I guess, more or less over the last few years, somebody's ability to do a project that they want to do because it's kind of their drive and their goal? And obviously some of the funding packages at the moment influence how that might be.
Absolutely, they do. That's correct. Fortunately, I'm not in that situation. I must say, I'm saying that very openly. I'm a member of the Max Planck Society, and the privilege of being a member of the Max Planck Society is that we get an agreed funding and we do whatever we want to do with it. And so I don't care about any funding. And I'm not applying grants. I don't want to waste my time. Sorry to say that openly. Of course, and I also did that before I won the prize. And for exactly that reason. If you're a good scientist, then you know exactly what to do because you have a vision. You understand the problem, you go for it. If you perhaps, well, are kind of opportunistic then, and you say, I can do this or I can do that, and they requested us doing that, the ministry or I don't know who, and then, of course, you tend to do this kind of thing, and rarely something important comes out, usually incremental work. This is what I believe. And so if you look at my trajectory, I didn't have fun. I had problems, of course, and this is also why I was not part of the science business, if you like it. Now science, to some extent, has become a business. You play the game, you connect, you go to meetings to connect. Then you make sure that your friends give you a positive reference when it comes to getting your grant through. And then the same applies vice versa. They also need some supporters. And this type of thing happens, even on the international scale. Even if you review papers and grants internationally, this happens. And this perpetuates, of course, mediocrity. And therefore, it's very important to have schemes where people can break out of this and try something else. I'm not saying that if a grant comes, but there may be somebody in the lab who thinks differently and then really does something. But just funding certain streams, of course, leads to a reinforcement of the stream. And I may say that. So when I had the first evidence for that this is possible and is going to work, this was in '99. I first sent it to Nature. They wouldn't send it out for review. And I think you believe me now that I can be very persuasive and write clear transmittal letters. It was very clear, really saying this is going to make a fundamental difference in light microscopy and how light microscopy will be perceived. It was not sent out. Then I rewrote it for Science. I sent it to Science. They didn't send it out for review. I called up the editor and explained in simple words, listen, this is a landmark in the history of light microscopy. No. Why? Because the editors, of course, they didn't hear about it, they couldn't imagine. The reviewers who were the so-called experts were not interested in having that because it would have put them out of business and all this stuff. And so I had difficulties publishing it. So I got it in PNAS, which is, well, Post Nature and Science. And I was lucky that there was a reviewer who heard me giving a talk. And because he talked with me personally, he knew what's in there. And he said, you have to publish this. And so this is how it works. And so you have to be very careful about the mainstream. And so-called expert wisdom may not be wisdom. Maybe expert consensus, or trend, but not reality.
Are there any other questions? If not, thank you so much.
Thank you.
A brilliant talk. Thank you.